commentary on Amazon is already on the record. But also many opportunities can be seen by the way that the sector is embracing the digital revolution. The government recognises its importance for cultural and economic reasons, and the government is working closely with the publishing industry to create an intellectual property environment which sustains success and rewards creativity. That's it. No, we continue.
Okay, thank you.
You ready?
Countess Mark.
Exactly.
A Vice Chair of the All-Party Group for ME and a patron of a number of ME charities. The PACE trial was funded by the MRC, the Department of Health, the Scottish Chief Scientist's Office and the Department for Work and Pensions to the tune of £5 million. The researchers, led by Chief Principal Investigator Professor Peter White, have consistently and confidently advised medical professionals and the government of the success of cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT, and graded exercise therapy, GET. The principal investigators' PI's objective was to reverse the behavioural and cognitive factors which they believed to be responsible for the perpetuation of symptoms and disability. Despite the extensive biomedical evidence base of peer-reviewed papers which undermines their belief, and despite the fact that the MRC now states that the evidence of inflammatory mechanisms in the brain and spinal cord, their view has prevailed. Throughout the history of medicine, there's been a predominance of doctrine over science, and currently there's a similar conflict between the doctrine, which asserts that ME/CFS results from disordered psyche, and the scientific view that it is a devastating organic disease. We do not know what disorder was being studied, because in March 2011, the chief PI wrote to the editor of The Lancet, "The PACE trial paper does not purport to be studying CFS-ME, but CFS defined simply as a principal complaint of fatigue. To whom then can CBT and GET be safely applied?" The Minister cannot answer because on the 17th of January, her Right Honourable friend Norman Lamb confirmed that no assessment of the PACE trial has been made. Furthermore, the PACE trial results have not been presented transparently. This is not uncommon, and Dr. Ben Goldacre, known for his bad science column in The Guardian, has initiated a campaign calling for the publication of all results of all trials, not just selective results. Already over 7,000 signatures have been collected, and a high-profile organisations such as the MRC, the Cochrane Collaboration, the Public Library of Science and the BMJ. It calls for all universities, ethics committees and medical bodies to recognise that underreporting of trials, as occurred in the PACE trial, is misconduct. Misreporting of clinical trial data leads to harm, wastes money and prevents scientific progress. A recent Science Media Centre press release states about the PACE trial, "The authors worked hard to define recovery based on data available from the trial. My Lord's, investigators must define their primary outcomes before a trial begins and abide by them, not define recovery based on trial data." Once the PACE trial was underway, the PIs changed the outcome measures so that the very same score on physical functioning, the SF-36 scale, represented both eligibility to enter the trial and normal functioning at the end of it. Indeed, according to The Lancet, a participant could have achieved a worse score at the end of the trial and yet still be classed as recovered. When funding was granted and ethical approval agreed, a participant had to score 85 to be considered recovered. By the time of the publication in The Lancet, this recovery score had dropped to 60, which is 5 points lower than that required to enter the study. This illogical situation resulted from the departure from the published protocol. To overcome this, the chief PI created his own meaning of terms. For example, recovery does not mean recovery, as the world understands it, and a return to normal does not mean a return to normal health. The Chief PI does, however, concede that improvement and not reaching research criteria are different from recovery. My Lords, we do not know how many patients reach the initial target of recovery because the PIs have refused requests to release that data. Instead, they've introduced significantly lower measures of improvement and abandoned an objective measure, the wearing of an lactometer. The results of the subjective reporting in the 6-minute walking test after graded exercise therapy were very poor, placing participants below the performance of patients waiting heart or lung transplant. Had the PIs achieved their anticipated level of success, a level consistent with their claims over many years, and a major factor in the award of research grants, they would have achieved international acclaim. What hit the headlines was the Lancet comment claiming a 30% recovery rate. And yet the best that has been shown from CBT and GET is a maximum of 15% improvement rate. A recent paper by the PACE authors purporting to show recovery rates, published on the 1st of February, is a masterpiece of obfuscation. The authors have substituted recovery for reversal of CFS without any explanation, and yet they admit that although many patients improved, the question of how many patients recovered remains unanswered. As one of the members of the Forward ME group said, it really is quite bizarre that there's absolutely no data whatsoever in this paper on what most people would regard as markers for recovery. That is a return or ability to return to full-time employment or education, and no longer claiming any DWP sickness or disability benefits. The original claims made for recovery made it to the media, into the minds of GPs, of DWP officials, social care providers and private insurance companies, and even of the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. Professor Trudy Cholder, one of the PACE trial PIs, said, twice as many people on graded exercise therapy and cognitive behaviour therapy got back to normal. That was widely but incorrectly interpreted as recovery. My Lords, the fact is that as opposed to the spin that accompanied the publication of selective results, only 15% improved with CBT and GET, leaving 85% with no benefit from these interventions. Furthermore, the combined CBT and GET groups of 321 people, 91% experienced adverse events, and only those who were well enough to attend regular hospital appointments were included in the trial. The severely affected and the housebound were excluded. This is not mentioned in the recovery rates when the recovery rates are discussed. From where have the PIs derived the figures of 22% for their latest recovery in their latest paper? My Lords, where does that leave us? The only information published in the cost-effective analysis of the PACE trial shows that there was no significant improvement after CBT and GET in the average of number of days lost from work or the number of participants who lost days at work. In fact, claims for income-related benefits, illness and disability-related benefits, and private pensions and income protection schemes all increased across all intervention groups during the trial. Because it is cheaper for CFS-ME to be dismissed as a behavioural problem, patients are denied access to diagnostic facilities by NICE guidelines, and there are very few medical consultants who specialise in anything but the supposed behavioural aspects of this disease. ME charities are inundated with cries for help as their members struggle with the benefits and social care systems. Bedridden and housebound claimants are put into the RAG group for ESA and are too ill to appeal. If they do manage to get to an ATOS assessment, they feel they're not listened to and are told they're fit for work. The DWP part-funded the PACE trial because they were assured that CBT and GET would get people back off benefits and back to work. But the promised return to employment figures have still not been provided by the PIs. My Lords, I'm relieved that the Medical Research Council's expert group, under the chairmanship of Professor Stephen Holgate, are launching a UK chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalitis research collaborative on April the 22nd. They recognise that, in the light, and I quote, of the magnitude of the disease burden on those affected and their families, involving both adults and children, there is an urgent need to increase the research effort in this field. £1.6 million has already been allocated to the MRC, by the MRC. There is an equally urgent need to assess the effects that the outcome of the PACE trial has had upon people with ME. But how can Her Majesty's Government act responsibly in assessing this when the results have not been presented transparently? My Lords, it's widely accepted within the ME CFS community that the PACE trial PIs changed the primary outcome measures with the intention of artificially inflating the success of CBT and GET, treatments they've promoted for over 20 years, and that consequently they're guilty of scientific misconduct. They believe that White and colleagues have showed that they're not responsible guardians of the valuable data collected in the trial, and it is therefore a matter of great importance that it is reanalysed by an independent group using the original criteria for recovery and the positive outcomes described in the published protocol. This would enable healthcare commissioners to make decisions based on data that they know has not been misrepresented. I know the Noble Baroness, the Minister, understands the problem and ask that she and her colleagues from other affected departments order such an assessment so that we don't consign thousands of people to the shadows. To quote Orwell, we must not allow the PACE trial to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind.
I think we're all very grateful to the noble lady, the Countess of Mar, for introducing this debate. I will be very brief, and I do apologise to her that I missed the first minute of her speech. Very surprisingly, we're much earlier, and unfortunately the previous speaker, Gardner of Kimball, was still on the screen when I came into the chamber. One of the issues, I think, with this syndrome, which causes persistent fatigue in for more than 6 months, together with various other symptoms, which is not relieved by rest, is that it is and has for a long time been puzzling. It isn't that there hasn't been a lot of research. I've looked, for example, at Medline, and we can see that on Medline there are 5,874 research papers on this condition. And it's very, very clear that extensive work, it's not just the Medical Research Council which funded the PACE survey, but also many other countries have been involved. For example, I've made a recent list of just papers published in the last year, and I won't bore your lordships with all of them. But for example, Moss Morris at King's, Dr. White, of course, at Barts we know of, Dr. Lehmann in Bavaria, Dr. Forbach in Denmark, Fukuda in Japan, Jackson in Australia, Lewis in Bethesda, Maryland, part of the NIH that's studied, which has been funded there, Weiberg from Hamburg and Blenberg from Amsterdam, Newton from Newcastle, Brooks from Huddersfield, Wesley, of course, from King's, and Vincent from the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. There are many other names, but these are very prestigious departments of medicine, and they all come to the same conclusion, effectively, that really at the present time, the best treatment is almost certainly along the lines of cognitive behavioural therapy. And of course, what is different about the PACE study is that this is a detailed, controlled study which has extremely rigorous entry into it. And unlike most of the previous studies, I think I'm right in saying, maybe the Noble Lord Alderdice might correct me if I'm wrong, but only one dropout in that study, which is fairly remarkable. It means that actually it's extremely comprehensive, so there are very good data, and they've looked at, I think, a series of issues about treatment, and it seems pretty clear to me that cognitive behavioural therapy, which actually is a bit more successful than the Noble Lady claims. It's more like 1/5 of the patients, so I don't think we should underestimate that. And they go some way to explain that were cognitive behavioural therapy used perhaps on a slightly more financially secure footing with rather more sessions, then they feel that it's likely that there would be more benefit, particularly towards the end of the treatment. I think one of the issues is this, that far too frequently we see that many of our colleagues have been vilified. These are simply because they're psychiatrists. It doesn't mean to say they're not doctors. That is, I think, a real issue. And it's not only psychiatrists who've been vilified, but, for example, Myra McClure, who was quite sure that there was not a viral causation for this disease was absolutely vilified and decided she'd give up her research. And this is also true of Esther Cranby, who even went so far as to report her vilification to the press and changed her telephone number. And as some of you will know, I think Dr. Simon Wesley claims that he had death threats, which is, I think, very serious. The problem, of course, is that very often these vague conditions which appear to be almost certainly with a psychiatric basis, it doesn't mean to say that because they've got that kind of basis that they're less important or some way the person who's suffering from them is to blame. What it means actually is we've got to find rational ways of treating them. So I commend this study. I think it's an example of a really excellent piece of research done in a very difficult phenotype and done very well indeed. And I think the authors are to be congratulated on demonstrating very clearly that cognitive behavioural therapy, and to a certain extent some exercise in addition, is a real improvement on what has happened for these patients before.
Like the Noble Order of Winston, I'm grateful to the noble lady, the Countess of Mar, for giving us an opportunity to look at this question, though I do have some doubts as to whether Your Lordship's House is actually the best place in which to evaluate scientific evidence and do the exploration. I actually think that repeated research by other colleagues and demonstration within the scientific community is the way to move forward. However, I think the first thing I'd want to say, and I would declare a previous interest as previously a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS, where I treated a number of patients with these types of symptoms. The history of medicine is that we've tried to clump together groups of symptoms which appear relatively regularly together and seem to have some indication of possible outcome and maybe of management and treatment. But these are temporary constructs, and it's perfectly possible that they are a whole bunch of different disorders that are overlapping in various ways. So even to talk about it as a condition, it seems to me is making certain kinds of presumptions. And certainly to have a conclusion that there is a definite organic basis, other than to say that in every disorder there are organic and psychological elements. When we think, we can only think because some things are going on in our brains, which is a physical substrate. But that doesn't mean that we dismiss the psychological, on the contrary. So my own position in this would have to be that we really don't know what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a whole range of symptoms and complaints that people have. We don't know what the etiology is. The prognosis is very variable with different people. And we've got to continue on doing work the best we can. But in the meantime, it's terribly important that we try to evaluate how to manage the problems that people come along to us with. You know, we don't really properly understand the schizophrenias. It's a whole group of different disorders, but we still have to manage the very large number of people who have these problems, and that's the case with this group of people who come along with post-exertional fatigue and memory difficulties and pains and so on and so on. Now, when we try to do that, it's not uncommon for patients to tell us that such and such a thing helps and such a thing doesn't. I remember when I started working, and I'm not a particularly strong advocate of CBT, as some colleagues know, but I remember when I was working using CBT with some patients with depression, they would come along and I would ask them to do a diary of what they were doing every half hour and evaluate it and so on and so on and so on. And they would say, you know, I don't feel like getting up in the morning, and I'm just too depressed and I can't get out of bed. And we would evaluate that. I would say, look, I know you don't feel like it, but please try to get out of bed and structure some activity for the day and do it on an hourly basis, and let's see how you are. And hey presto, of course, when they actually did that, the thing that they felt would not make them better actually did make them feel better. And they were surprised about this. This is one of the dilemmas about what patients think will help, because sometimes they are intuitively right and sometimes they are intuitively mistaken. And the only way that you can understand this is to actually do some work in a scientific way. And this is what these colleagues in this particular paper have tried to do. And some of them will have had particular notions about etiologies, but the point is they were simply looking at what worked and didn't work. What's the outcome? The outcome is CBT and graduated exercise training is helpful for some people to some extent, and it's more helpful than the other things that have been suggested. It's not helpful to everybody. It's not completely helpful probably to almost anybody, but it's better than doing nothing, and it's better than the other things that have been suggested. And that's really, there's a lot of scientific tables and graphs and stuff, but that's the basic outcome to it. Now, to me, that's good news, because it gives us some indication of things that might be helpful. But it also tells us that an awful lot more work is necessary in order to find out, what are we dealing with? Somebody came along and said, well, there's such a thing as chest diseases, and we should treat them in such and such a way, and the cause is this. We'd say, well, yeah, well, it's true, but, there is a bit of a difference between asthma and cancer. And you say, oh, really? Right. Well, let's explore that. And we're kind of at that kind of level with this set of symptoms. Now, what's really important is that when people do give themselves to scientific enterprise in this area, that we don't pillory them for their efforts. Because they may come up with some outcomes that people don't want to believe, or that are not very welcome to folk. We're, as psychiatrists, we're quite used to the idea that very often people would rather have a physical explanation for things than a psychological explanation of things. And I think it's dreadful if we, in a way, encourage that by saying, well, of course it's not psychological, as though somehow or another that's a smear on a patient that they've got psychological difficulties. So we've got to be very careful about that. And I don't suggest that members of your Lordship's House would do that, but it is something that happens out there in the community and about which we must be really very careful. So I'm glad we have the debate. I trust that we understand the very early stage that we're at. It's good that there is some indication, and I think the paper does demonstrate that CBT and GET are helpful and are probably more helpful than other things, but there's a lot more to do, and we should be encouraging people to get into the research work, not just for the etiology issue, but for what helps, and not be pillorying people who do come in, because it only drives people out of the research, and that's the last thing that we want to see.
My Lords, I want to thank my noble friend, the Countess of Mar, for tabling this question for short debate concerning the PACE trial. I must declare an interest as former chair of the East London Foundation Trust. Professor White, a leading researcher in the PACE trial, works as a consultant in that trust in addition to his research post with Queen Mary University. CFS-ME can be a very seriously disabling syndrome, and I like to refer to syndrome because it isn't one disease. It seems to me it's a number. NICE compares the physical symptoms of CFS-ME with those of multiple sclerosis, systemic lupus erythematosus, if I can pronounce it correctly, and rheumatoid arthritis. Probably three of the most fearsome illnesses that one can think of. To make matters worse for sufferers, as Lord Alderdice has so rightly said, is that the causes and disease processes of the CFS-ME are not yet understood. And that must be a deeply frightening thing, I think, for any patient. Doctors can misdiagnose sufferers, or worse still, dismiss them as not really physically ill at all. I mean, I understand, for some psychological aspects may be important. For others, maybe not. I mean, I'm aware of people who've had major viruses and suddenly been struck down, having led very, very active lives, got on with things, been fine. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about any assumption about physical, psychological, or whatever. CFS-ME is all too real, as far as I'm concerned. Of course, we do need much more research. I await the outcome of Professor White's cytokine research later this year, for example. And we look to the MRC and others, of course, to prioritise this distressing syndrome. Thankfully, the MRC has two boards, probably they've got others, but two. One funds studies like PACE and the others, and the other funds studies into the immune system, viral and genetic considerations. The PACE study did not in any way affect funding for organic CFS-ME research. And I think that's terribly important because I think there are fears around that it may have. The experts believe that in time, a number of, as you've said, as the Noble Lord has said, a number of distinct diseases, they'll be identified and they will, that currently fall within the CFS-ME label. In the meantime, though, NICE recommends CBT and/or graded exercise therapy for people with mild or moderate CFS-ME because these are the interventions for which there is the clearest evidence of of benefit to patients. No doubt in time, treatments which attack the causes and achieve better and faster results will be developed. But in the meantime, it is actually a great step forward that, as in the PACE trial, 22% of patients recover, and I agree there's a debate about the word recovery, but only after 13 sessions of CBT or graded exercise. And 60% of patients achieve significant improvements in both fatigue and exercise levels after the same period, according to the PACE study. And that certainly fits with my experience of a limited number of people, about half a dozen who I know. A meta-analysis showed a 50% recovery rate after 1 year. These results are very significantly better than spontaneous recovery rates or recovery rates following alternative treatments available. From our most helpful discussion on Monday, I understand that my noble friend, Countess of Mar, respects the PACE study, but very reasonably, in my view, has grave concerns about the spin put on the results. I think people do have to be very, very careful. In the media, we all know what happens once things get into the media, but actually the spin put on these things is really important for patients. Things can be very, very hurtful. Now to the DWP. I understand the DWP may treat people as work shy if they've not undergone a CBT-GET treatment regime. At least a quarter of PCT areas do not have any specialist services for these patients. Others have grossly inadequate services, pathetic levels of services. It is essential that the DWP and indeed insurance companies take account of the non-availability of such services in many, many areas. I'd ask the noble lady, the Minister, if she'll pass on this concern to Lord Freud. It really is important, actually. The DWP also need to be aware that CFS ME patients can take time to improve. I'm not an expert, but from the people I know, several have needed much longer than 1 year to recover acceptable levels of functioning. In terms of returning to work, the PACE trial had no effect whatsoever on the numbers of CFS ME patients in work. I wouldn't expect it to have done. These people, on average, had been out of work for 2.5 years before they entered the trial. And from all the work a number of us have done over many, many, many years, we know it is incredibly difficult to get people back into work if they've been out of work for 2.5, 3.5 years. But what did reduce were the social care costs and the need for family support, and that's very important. People were much better. Not necessarily completely better, but an awful lot of them were much better. Now I want to address a few other issues arising from the PACE study. That 10% of patients deteriorated during the period of the trial. I understand that all these deteriorations resulted from life events or other infections during the trial period, and we know well that serious life events or further infections do cause or can cause relapses in this horrible set of illnesses or this syndrome. Secondly, did ME patients benefit from the PACE trial? I'm reliably informed that 51% of the patients in the PACE trial had been defined as having ME. I know there are all sorts of debates about this, but had been defined as having ME, and there was no significant difference in the outcome from treatment of patients who had been deemed as suffering from ME relative to patients who had been given the CFS label. And I think that's really important. There have been concerns expressed about the 11 serious adverse reactions to treatment. The 10 possible adverse reactions were equally distributed across the 4 treatment types. Very important this. There's no indication that CBT or GET caused any problems. There was one probable serious adverse reaction, and this was in the medical treatment group and was a reaction to an antidepressant. Some of us are very familiar that people can have reactions to antidepressants. There is no evidence that CBT or GET can be dangerous. The PACE trial is the largest ever trial of treatments of this debilitating set of conditions. It's received acclaim from clinicians and scientists across the world. Some have wanted to criticise it for changes to the protocol, but these were made before the analysis and were approved by the Independent Trial Steering Committee. They were not fixes, they were approved by that committee. The changes were minor and did not affect the results or conclusions in any significant way. Any potential conflicts of interest were published alongside all the papers, and none applied to the statisticians who did the analysis, a little tiny bit. It is very encouraging that the Association for Young People with ME accept that the NICE guidelines are useful for patients and healthcare practitioners. They are right. In conclusion, can the Noble Lady, the Minister, give this House an assurance that the Commissioning Board will give in future equal priority to the specialist services needed for CFS-ME to the priority they give for rheumatoid arthritis and MS?
My Lords, I also greatly welcome this debate. This is a terrible condition, and actually we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are suffering from it. And I think it is clear that although there have been lots of studies relative to the seriousness and pervasiveness of this condition, there is far too little research into what is causing it. But I want to focus on treatment, and I think that there have been terrible misunderstandings and misconceptions put about on that score, and I just want to make 4 points. First, the issue of what causes a condition is often quite different from the issue of how we can best treat it. This is such a basic point, but I think it's not fully understood by many of the people who are suffering from this condition. Coronary heart disease may be caused by cholesterol, but we treat it with a stent. Same way, chronic fatigue may be caused by a virus, and yet the best treatment at the moment available may include a psychological therapy. The form of treatment implies nothing about what we believe to be the cause. So I think that people who suffer from CFS, and in almost all cases feel it's not psychological in origin, are surely making a mistake when they reject psychological support for their condition on the ground this implies something about its cause. They should, in their own interest, focus on what is the best possible treatment available on the evidence. So my second point is that we do have quite a lot of evidence about what treatments work. Surely more will be discovered in future, and some of them will surely be biological. But in the meantime, we have a large amount of evidence that both CBT and graded exercise therapy enable many more people to recover than if the only treatment they have is standard medical care. And the main point I want to make here is this is so whatever the definition of recovery. It's wrong to suggest this all depends on the definition of recovery. You can put the cut-off for recovery in many different places, and you will always find that people who get CBT and graded exercise therapy do better than people who only have standard medical care. There are many studies preceding PACE which showed this, and of course that is the main finding of PACE. I would say it's a fine piece of work by all normal standards, and I think some of the criticisms are really misleading. Some of them have been answered already. I'd just like to come back to this question of the change in the protocol and stress that this was made before any analysis was done of the results. So it wasn't that they looked at the results and said, let's change the recovery criterion. The changes were made because of discussions affecting the whole research world and agreed by the trial steering committee. What I think is very interesting, there is actually a separate paper which has been written simply on the recovery issue, which uses 5 or 6 different criteria of recovery. And again, in the PACE study shows that whatever cut-off you use, you get this same difference between the outcome of CBT and graded exercise therapy. So there really isn't a conjuring trick going on here, and I think it's wrong for this impression to be given to the community of people who are suffering if it leads to them not receiving help which they could really benefit from. I think instead of criticising the study, we should be rejoicing that we have more evidence, again, that there's something which can be done which is better than standard medical care. So moving on to my third point, actually, in a way, it's been made before, but I think, given the strength of this evidence that we have these treatments that work, it is shocking that they are so little available. This is a part of a wider story of the non-availability of psychological therapy. But this survey, which was done by Action for ME, found that there were a large number of PCTs which provided no specialist treatment clinics for this condition, or providing any kind of care, let alone this most evidence-based care. That is a disgrace. I hope the Minister can say something about that. The treatments are not unsafe. This has often been put about by the fact that, of course, some people get worse during treatment. The only argument that there would be against the treatment, if that's the case, would be if people who didn't receive the treatment were less likely to get worse. And again, the statistics are absolutely clear. The proportion of people who get worse in treatment is no higher than the people who get worse who are not in treatment. So there is no argument whatever that this is unsafe. So how could we hope to get a better deal for this large group of sufferers? Obviously, my fourth point, the worst possible way to get it is to turn the area into a battleground. I mean, it gives the commissioners the perfect excuse for doing nothing. It gives people of goodwill who might come in and really try and help people with this condition a serious disincentive for getting into this field. And as we know, and that's already been said, many of the people, or certainly some of the people who work in this area, have received repeated insult and even death threats. And I would like to pay particular tribute to Sir Simon Wesley at King's College, London, who has led the field for many years in this area and who has stuck to it despite all this harassment. I think he and his other colleagues...
The Noble Lord is in his 7th minute. We are very tight on time. I'm worried that the Minister will not have time to reply.
I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
My Lords, I also thank my noble friend, the Countess Mar, for raising such an important topic. I've read the research very carefully in preparing my short contribution. We know that some patients who develop symptoms of CFS-ME will recover fully, but the majority go on to have a fluctuating long-term condition. I agree with the Noble Lord Alderdice that there is no single cause for this condition. 10 to 12% of people who have glandular fever will develop the symptoms of CFS-ME, but there are many other precipitants too. This is a very distressing condition for people to have. It's confusing and difficult for families, friends and employers, particularly because the condition may fluctuate in its effects so dramatically and vary in its severity. It's not surprising that people with CFS-ME may feel that they are not believed and that their family and friends are unsympathetic at times. Imagine living with an illness that fluctuates, that recurs after mild exertion and is associated with what people describe as brain fog. As it stands, there are a very limited range of therapies available, and understandably, this patient group has ended up feeling overlooked and neglected. But, my Lords, the greatest weapon against illness and disease is robust peer-reviewed research. Research into causation and the factors that sustain symptoms are both important, as is research into effective interventions. I'm particularly pleased that current biomedical research funded by the MRC is trying to understand some of the mechanisms at play, including looking at mitochondrial function, at autonomic dysfunction, and at sleep disturbance. It's essential that we continue to look at the best possible treatments. I will speak briefly about the PACE trial, which of course most people have spoken about. It enrolled 640 participants. And just last week, the follow-up study looking at recovery after 1 year was published in the journal Psychological Medicine. You may know that the trial showed that an average of only 13 sessions of CBT or 13 sessions of graded exercise therapy over just 6 months, as a supplement to good specialist medical care, had rates of recovery of 22%. Well, by recovery, my understanding is that the researchers included the fact that at a year these patients no longer met criteria for CFS-ME. My Lords, this would be heralded as a fantastic outcome for treatment of MS or Parkinson's disease or cancer. only 8% of those receiving adapted pacing therapy and 7% receiving just specialist medical care received the same or achieved the same degree of recovery. In other words, the successful treatments were 3 times more likely to lead to recovery than the comparison treatments. Of course, this is after just 1 year, but follow-up is continuing, and I'm looking forward to hearing whether these results will be sustained. I hope the Noble Lady, the Minister, will agree with me that it would be very useful if this study was funded for follow-up for 5 years, particularly given the fluctuating nature of the condition. Better outcomes are achieved for all illnesses, from heart disease and cancer to schizophrenia and depression, when the overall well-being of the patient, biological, psychological and social well-being are taken into account. That's not to say that there is no physical reason behind the onset of illness, nor that physiological effects are not continuing to maintain or modify the disease process. My Noble Friends debate today is concerned with both health and care, including access to benefits. It's yet another reminder of the importance of a holistic approach to care, an intertwining, if you like, of body and mind. This complex interaction has, of course, been acknowledged since ancient times, but somehow over the last 100 years, with the elucidation of many physical causes for illness, the mind-body connection has been somewhat forgotten. Thankfully, this connection has again been brought to the fore by the government's very welcome commitment to parity of esteem between physical and mental health. And the Royal College of Psychiatrists, of which I am a former president, has long been concerned about the physical effects of psychological stress and the psychological effects of physical stress. Interdisciplinary research, which brings together, for example, the neuropsychiatrist with the immunologist, is vitally important. I would like to ask the Noble Lady, the Minister, if she could clarify the arrangements being made to ensure that evidence-based treatments, such as those tested in the PACE trial and recommended by NICE, are commissioned, and that they don't fall through any gaps caused by what has been called an orphan status for this condition. To explain what I mean, CFS-ME can be classified under both neurological and psychiatric disorders for clinical purposes, and it's not clearly claimed by any one specialist group as being their primary responsibility. This means that many people diagnosed with CFS-ME will not be referred to a specialist centre, and that the treatment they need will just not be available. Research will shine more light on this condition and begin to distinguish whether subgroups of patients will be more responsive to different new treatments being evidenced and introduced. Research is needed into all aspects of the illness so that more effective treatments can be found, and this must include both biological aspects and any psychological factors which may sustain or lead to further deterioration of the illness, such as, for example, major life events which are known to cause a relapse in ME/CFS. Thankfully, the MRC has recognised the past underinvestment in this poorly understood condition or set of conditions by highlighting ME/CFS as a priority area for research. And through the particular efforts of Professor Stephen Hallgate, this CFS-ME Research Collaborative, which was mentioned by my noble friend, will be launched in April and will bring together researchers from all relevant disciplines with patient groups and charities. This is so important. My lords, the future is looking brighter for people with ME/CFS, and the constructive collaboration of people with different perspectives and contributions will, I hope, prove to be a major step forward.
My lords, excuse me, I've got a cold. I too welcome this debate and acknowledge the noble lady, the Countess of Mar's work on CFS-ME as Chair of Forward-ME and Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Although a last-minute stand-in for this debate for my noble friend Lord Hunt, who is shortly due in the Chamber for the Ms. Staff's report statement, I'm not new to this issue, as the noble lady regularly contributes on CFS-ME to the health debates I have participated in. Most recently, our extensive debate last November on the neurological diseases initiated by my noble friend Lady Ford. What's new to me is the focus on the PACE trial and the opportunity to hear from our expert medical and psychiatrist colleagues about the wider issues and perspectives, and about the trial itself, what it covered, who was involved in its findings and results, and indeed about the wider extensive research that is currently being undertaken across the world. As we have heard, the PACE trial was the largest ever randomised controlled trial of treatments of CFS-ME, primarily funded by the Medical Research Council following competitive peer review and its main findings concerning efficacy and safety published in The Lancet. It was designed to compare improvements in safety after CBT and GET with outcomes after ADP and SMC. The patients were recruited from hospital clinics in England and Scotland who were able to travel to clinics to receive treatment. It was not designed to test treatments in patients with severely disabling illness, and it does seem to me, as a non-expert, that some of the criticisms and disappointments levelled at PACE do not fully recognise this. As we've heard from noble lords in this debate, the trial did provide clear evidence that both CBT and GET were better than ADP or SMC in improving both symptoms and disability. In fact, all the treatments were found to be safe without any serious reactions to treatments in any of the treatment groups. I understand that a paper published last week showed that CBT and GET are 3 times more likely to bring about recovery than any of the other treatments. Like other speakers, I want to underline the importance of looking to the future. On the NICE guidelines, I support noble lords who stress that the key issue about the guidelines is making sure they are actually implemented so that patients can receive effective treatment and care wherever they live in the UK. My lords, in the 20th of November debate, the noble lady Baroness Northover assured the House that all the neurological and specialist conditions would have, quote, equal priority under the new NHS commissioning arrangements, and that this would mean that the Cinderella conditions should be improved. Can the noble lady outline the steps the government is taking to ensure that the commissioning arrangements provide appropriate and adequate specialist care for patients suffering from illnesses such as CFS and ME, which are not easily classified under normal commissioning arrangements? And to help this, will the government give CCGs guidance on which illnesses should qualify under special commissioning arrangements? And can she also reassure us that this guidance will include ensuring that guided exercise training is provided by qualified and trained specialist therapists? Thank you.
My Lords, I would like to thank the noble Countess for initiating this debate, and I'd like to apologise that my noble friend Earl Howe can't be here because he's in the chamber because of taking the mid-staff statement. And I too am a last-minute replacement. But I know that the noble lady has a particular and personal interest in this subject, and I pay tribute to the way that she continues to raise issues of concern in your Lordship's House, as well as her unswerving commitment to improving the experience of people living with CFS-ME. And I begin by recognising how distressing and debilitating the condition can be for individuals, their carers and their families. And equally, I recognise the difficulties that many patients face in getting the treatment and care they need to help them manage their illness and where they can make a recovery. And we've heard that this afternoon. I'm sure that we all agree that the most important thing is to ensure that patients receive the treatment and care that they need. I think that at this point it's worth acknowledging that whilst many patients feel let down by the system, many patients do have a positive experience and have worked with health and social care professionals to manage their care effectively. I think it's also important to acknowledge that doctors and other professionals working in this field are highly committed to providing the best possible care for their patients. We want to see people with CFS-ME being listened to when it comes to decisions about what type of treatment and care may best meet their individual needs, and I know that across the country many doctors are working with their patients to achieve this, so I hear what my noble friend Lord Alderdice says in this regard. There is no doubt that there is widespread uncertainty surrounding this condition, and that's shone through in this debate. There's controversy, disagreement, and divided and often polarised opinion about its causes and the best way to treat it. The kind of issues raised by the noble Countess today have surrounded the debate for many years, and we've seen how passionate but how often opposed are those seeking to address these problems in this debate this afternoon.
It is an unfortunate fact that despite a great deal of worldwide research, and Lord Winston made clear how extensive this is, we do not yet know definitively the cause or causes of CFS-ME, whether it's a disease, a condition as Lady Hollins described it, a syndrome as Baroness Meacher described it. And Lord Winston and Lord Layard are surely right that it's concerning if researchers are in any way intimidated as they seek to clarify these problems. CFS-ME is not alone in being mystifying. We do not know the causes of most cancers and other diseases such as Alzheimer's. That lack of knowledge, however, has not stopped us from seeking the best forms of treatment. Many of these diseases are treated well, even though we don't know their causes. I quite agree that more research is needed. In the meantime, patients want access to the best treatments that are available. So far, the only treatments that seem to have shown any benefit in clinical trials have been cognitive behaviour therapy and graded exercise therapy, but I've heard what noble lords have said in regard to these. This brings me to the PACE trial that seems to have prompted today's debate. The MRC's decision to fund this trial was based on the fact that there was a lack of high-quality evidence to inform the treatment of CFS-ME, and in particular on the need to evaluate the treatments that were already in use and for which there was insufficiently strong evidence from randomised controlled trials to support their effectiveness. The decision to fund this trial was based on the MRC's usual rigorous peer review process for clinical trials, as noble lords have emphasised. The experts who reviewed the application were satisfied that the design put forward was of high quality, would provide useful evidence to help doctors and patients decide whether any of the 4 treatments to be evaluated was likely to be worth pursuing, and would help inform decisions on the provision of treatments by the NHS. And Lord Winston argued that, and others have too, that this was a controlled and rigorous study. All agree that research is needed. The noble Countess, Lady Mar, raised a number of challenges which I'd like to try to address here. The noble Countess expressed concern about the selection method for participants, and can I assure the noble lady that having neurological symptoms like memory difficulties or muscle weakness did not exclude anyone from taking part in the trial, since these symptoms were medically recognised symptoms of the condition. And whilst researchers used the Oxford definition to define the condition in the PACE trial, participants were also assessed to see if they met the International Centres for Disease Control criteria, to see whether the effects of treatment were different in those who met this alternative definition. The independent members of the trial steering committee reviewed and agreed the plans for secondary analysis. She also expressed concern about the recovery statistics and other areas in relation to the protocol. As for all MRC-funded studies, it is the responsibility of the investigators and the relevant journals, guided by peer reviewers, to determine how findings are published and when. The investigators' first paper on the outcomes of the PACE study was published in The Lancet in March 2011. A later paper was published in August 2012, dealing with the cost-effectiveness of the interventions, and further papers will be published, including papers showing a long-term 2.5 years follow-up. Now, the noble lady, Lady Hollins, made the very important point about follow-up, and no doubt the MRC will be bearing this in mind and will look at this debate, and follow-up in all these trials is very important. The noble lady, the Countess of Mar, asked about severely disabled patients being excluded from the trial. Patients had to be able to attend hospital for treatments, but a number needed mobility aids, and others received treatment by telephone when too unwell to attend clinic once recruited. The noble lady also asked about whether the trial data could be reanalysed. There are, as she will know, ethical and legal barriers to releasing data to a member of the public without consent when these data contain medical information that might identify the patient. The main outcome data have already been independently analysed by a Cochrane collaborative group, and a paper is being prepared for publication, and I know she'll look at that with interest. An often voiced criticism is that the money spent on the PACE trial would have been better spent research into causes. As Lady Meacher has indicated, though, the two are not mutually exclusive, and while understanding the cause of the condition is obviously important, if there are potential treatments available, it is equally important to test their effectiveness so that they can be introduced into service. Of relevance to this, the PACE trial was testing adaptive pacing therapy, which had not been previously tested in a large trial, and which is supported by patient organisations. Various noble lords have paid tribute to the quality of the research, even though the noble lady, the Countess of Mar, was more sceptical. As the noble Countess is aware, the findings of the PACE study reflect the recommendations in current NICE guidance. I understand that concerns have been expressed that patients may have their choices about care restricted because the PACE trial supports their non-recommendation by NICE, or that they may be forced into treatments they don't want because they're recommended. Can I assure noble lords that clinical guidelines published by NICE help to promote consistency, but they recognise that patients are individuals who may require different forms of management. Clinicians are therefore free to adapt the guidelines when deciding, in consultation with their patients, the most appropriate treatment. NICE routinely reviews the need to update its guidance in order to take account of the latest available evidence. And as the noble lady is aware, CFS-ME is currently a highlighted area, and as Lady Meacher explained, it's a high priority for the MRC, and the high-quality research that has been stimulated by the MRC's recent call will add to the future evidence base. Concern has been expressed that the findings of the trial will be used to reduce the number of people with CFS-ME on state benefits, and this was flagged up briefly by noble lords. I should like to dispel straight away the idea that CFS-ME is not recognised by the Department for Work and Pensions as a potentially serious condition. There are, for example, no targets for finding individuals fit for work in the work capability assessment process. Baroness Meacher suggested raised this particular area, and can I assure the noble lady that if patients do not comply with the CBT or if they don't take the treatment that's recommended to them, their benefits might be withdrawn. Can I assure her it's not the case? Entitlement to employment and support allowance is not based on compliance with specific treatments, and anyone claiming ESA will undergo the work capability assessment, and the work capability assessment is based on the premise that eligibility should not be based on a person's condition or the treatment regime for that condition, but rather on the way that condition limits their functional capability. I'm happy to flag this debate to DWP, as she asked me to, in regard to the availability of services. Lady Meacher asked me about the NHS Commissioning Board and whether it would give equal weight to a number of other diseases. I can assure her that the mandate to the NHS Commissioning Board will ensure that improvements are made to the quality of life to people living with all long-term conditions, including this one. Lord Layard asked me about specialist treatment provided by PCTs. In the new system, clinical commissioning groups will be responsible for commissioning specialist CFS-ME services. And they, as he knows, comprise of frontline clinicians. And we certainly hope that they will have a good understanding, therefore, of their local communities, including patients with these problems. The NHS Commissioning Board will hold those CCGs accountable for the services they commission, as well as providing support, for example, through the development of commissioning guides. And I understand that Martin McShane, long-term conditions lead at the NHS Commissioning Board, has already met with the CFS-ME patient groups to discuss their concerns. And these discussions will inform the board's work as things move forward. The government's aim is to help individuals who are suffering from these problems, both to receive appropriate treatment and also to get back to work where they can do that and to seek a better understanding of the situation that they're in. The PACE trial was funded to respond to the concerns of patients, carers and doctors that more research into CFS-ME was required. Of course, we all hope that health research results in people becoming healthier and fewer suffering from these kind of problems. But this is obviously a major focus for the MRC in making its individual funding decisions. In conclusion, I hope that the Noble Countess will agree that we are sympathetic to the needs of patients with CFS-ME, and I do appreciate, as other Noble Lords do, her many concerns. I hope I have reassured her that we're investing in improved services for CFS-ME patients and in an expanded research programme, and Noble Lords have emphasised the importance of research moving forward in this area.